The Habsburgs, one of the most powerful dynasties of all time. As German kings, as emperors of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, and most recently as emperors of Austria and kings of Hungary, they shaped the course of European history for centuries. As kings of Spain, they ruled over a new world empire in which the sun did not set, a sphere of influence that stretched from North Africa and reached as far as California. A combination of artful diplomacy and ruthless power politics turned an insignificant ducal family into a world-class dynasty. The Habsburgs waged wars and made marriage alliances with the same fervor, securing their influence and tying their fortunes to the significant noble families of Europe. Sometimes they took land and titles by force, but often they were just lucky enough to outlive their rivals. From the beginning of the 13th century, the Habsburgs continuously expanded their rule from their homeland in the west of the Holy Roman Empire. They began to move east to the region of present-day Austria, then to Bohemia and Hungary. Later, large regions and nations such as the Netherlands, Burgundy, Castile, and Aragon were added. Whole nations were defined and later subsumed in the course of history. Others were ruled by the dynasty for many centuries. After the tumult of the First World War, the Habsburg Empire disappeared forever. But to this day, many countries, cities, and regions are shaped by their time within its culture. Castles and palaces, monasteries and art collections remind us of this once so powerful dynasty. We will now travel through time to the most important locations that defined the Habsburgs. A journey that leads through more than a dozen present-day European states and back to the world more than 1,000 years ago. For more than half a millennium, the Hofburg in Vienna was one of the Habsburgs' most important centers of power. However, the impressive rise of the dynasty began with a brazen document forgery commissioned by the Austrian Duke Rudolf IV, the Privilegium Maius.
So it gave himself and his family an upgrade and claimed descent going all the way back to the Old Testament and hereditary rights in this land. And then snipped off the old seal of Frederick Barbarossa and carefully stuck it on to the new one, and then simply declared it legitimate. They even invented this wholly made-up term Archduke, Archduchess, specifically to their family, and they got away with it. It shows how so much of history is really to do with strong-willed and, in some cases, malicious individuals or very over-self-confident individuals simply making their own luck. And that luck lasted for the Habsburgs from the Middle Ages until the end of the First World War.
The small French town of Thann in Alsace, the ancestral home of the Habsburgs. In spring 2024, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's coronation mass is being performed here in the cathedral. The occasion for the festive evening: the marriage of Duke Albrecht of Austria to Johanna von Fürth from Alsace exactly 700 years ago. As the parents of Rudolf IV, they ensured the continuation of the Habsburg dynasty in the 14th century. The Via Habsburg Association also uses the historic anniversary as an occasion for its annual general meeting, at which new members from Alsace are admitted. Basically, the Via Habsburg is a cultural route according to the Council of Europe. The aim of these cultural routes is essentially to demonstrate the values of a common European history. There are many sites that are not yet members of the Via Habsburg, but are worthy of being members of the Via Habsburg. We want these sites, which were formative in the Habsburg era, to become members of the Via Habsburg. With his epitaph in the court church of Innsbruck in Tyrol, Emperor Maximilian I has left an impressive, lasting legacy. Even his contemporaries regarded him as one of the greatest rulers of his era. With great diplomatic skill, his father, Emperor Frederick III, arranged a momentous marriage alliance. The marriage to Mary of Burgundy in Bruges in 1477. The Burgundian marriage laid the foundations for the rise of the House of Austria to world power. The Habsburgs' power soon extended from the Alps to Spain. Maximilian's grandson, Charles V, and his great-grandson, Philip II, would rule over an empire where the sun never sets. Many regions and cities on the Iberian Peninsula have been associated with the Habsburg name for more than 500 years, as the Spanish kings had several residences. Many magnificent buildings were erected on the initiative of the Habsburgs, while others were taken over and extended by them. The Cathedral of Granada, which fell to the Spanish crown after the victory over the Muslim Emirate of Granada in 1492, is hugely symbolic. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon are buried here as a sign of their claim to power. Philip of Austria, nicknamed the Fair, and his wife Joan also find their final resting place in the royal chapel. (1492) is also the year in which the navigator Christopher Columbus discovers the sea route to America, financed by Isabella and Ferdinand. It is the beginning of a gigantic empire that spans the entire world. The Spaniards subjugate the empires of the Aztecs and Incas, conquer large parts of South, Central, and North America, and establish viceroyalties. The conquistadors, the Spanish conquerors, push further and further ahead. The consequences for the indigenous population are fatal. Millions die of famine and introduced diseases. Tens of thousands are murdered by the conquerors. When Charles V learns of the atrocities committed against the indigenous people, laws are passed to protect the Native Americans and declare them free men. The riches from the New World are soon used to also finance wars in the Old World. At the same time, a new kingdom is established on the Iberian Peninsula.
Today, we know that the incorporation of the Kingdom of Granada, in particular the Islamic Palace of the Alhambra, was a culmination for the political project of the so-called Catholic monarchs. Their aim was to create the first modern state in Europe, in the West, which was the result of the unification of different kingdoms. Initially, these were the kingdoms of King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile. Later, with the conquest of Granada in 1492, the kingdoms of Navarre and Leon and the Kingdom of Granada were added.
In the old town of Granada, numerous houses are reminiscent of the time of Arab rule in Andalusia. In the bazaar right next to the cathedral, traders offer their wares for sale, just as they did hundreds of years ago. The mighty palace complex of the Nasrid dynasty, which founds the Emirate of Granada in 1238, towers over the historic city center. And at its center is the palace of Charles V, a symbolic link between the old Muslim power and the new Christian one. With Charles V, the supreme ruler of Christendom, the message is that a new golden age begins.
Charles V presents himself as the new Charlemagne, the new emperor of Europe, the new blacksmith who serves Christianity and who integrates the formal language of Islamic architecture, which has been preserved in Granada, into his project. This was very important to him, and he was personally very involved and was responsible himself for the design of the formal and iconographic elements down to the last detail. He wanted to create a symbolic element in Granada that today we would describe as propagandistic, a symbol for this new Europe of the Renaissance and for the unity of the Roman and German empires, which he, Charles V, represented. And through his person, he creates a link between the Habsburg Dynasty, the Austrians, and Charlemagne, who was crowned by the Pope centuries ago. Now, it was he who was crowned the new emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in Bologna. And his palace in Granada was now to become a very special symbol for the erection of this new Europe.
A connecting corridor leads from the older Arab part of the palace to the private rooms of the emperor and king. Charles V never lived here, however, as the imperial palace remained unfinished for a very long time and was only completed in the 20th century. The Alhambra and the slightly higher Generalife are also famous for their magnificent gardens, in which Muslim and Christian elements merge. For both Christian and Muslim cultures, gardens are far more than just a place of contemplation. They represent the ideal of paradise and are therefore a symbolic anticipation of a transcendental human existence after death. As Roman-German emperor and ruler of the Spanish Empire, Charles V is a frequent traveler. He spends a lot of time in Toledo, the seat of the Catholic kings. It is not until 1563 that the court moves to Madrid. Even today, Charles V is almost omnipresent in Toledo. His coat of arms is emblazoned on one of the mighty city gates, and the statue of the emperor welcomes the city's many visitors. Charles resides in the Alcazar, the royal palace of Toledo. The path leads through the winding alleyways, many of which are reminiscent of the city's Moorish period, to the cathedral, one of the most important buildings of Spanish Gothic architecture. The reign of Charles in the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation is characterized by major political upheavals. At the Diet of Worms, the monk Martin Luther refuses to recant his theses. Luther is ostracized and translates the Bible into German at Wartburg Castle. It is the beginning of the confessional division of Europe, which would soon lead to bloody wars. Charles V fights in vain against the spread of the new Protestant faith, which spreads rapidly throughout the empire and is also to be seen as a political statement against the Catholic imperial family. Sick and frustrated, Charles resigns his crown and offices in Brussels in 1555. His brother Ferdinand succeeds him as emperor against his will. His last journey takes Charles to Extremadura in western Spain, where he has chosen the monastery of Yuste as the place where he would like to spend the rest of his life.
After the abdication of Charles V in October 1555 from all his offices in the Netherlands and the Spanish possessions on the Iberian Peninsula, in Italy and in America, his journey to Spain was planned, which took place in August. By September 28th, he was already in Laredo, and his journey to Extremadura took quite a long time. In November 1557, he saw the monastery for the first time. And on February 3rd, 1558, the day of St. Blaise, he finally moved into his rooms. And now began the final phase of Charles V's life in Yuste.
In the monastery, Charles devotes himself to his watch collection and spends a lot of time studying the Bible and other religious books. He attends Mass daily, has conversations with his confessor or servants of his small court, and dictates dispatches to the court.
Yuste was far away from all the centers of political power. He sought this seclusion, like the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was, in a way, a source of inspiration for him. Yuste was to be the spiritual place chosen by Charles V for his final retreat, which in reality was to crown the life of Charles V. It was to be another great deed, comparable to his military successes. Charles V was to appear as the great mythical hero, as the great emperor whose spiritual retreat would be his last great battle, with which he would go down in history and in eternity.
The former emperor is seriously ill, suffers from gout, and often has to be carried. In the fall of 1558, Charles V falls ill with malaria and dies on September 21st at the age of 57. Much has been and still is written about the Habsburgs. As an editor for a major publishing house in London, Simon Winder has not only edited numerous books about the dynasty, but has also visited most of the former Habsburg lands in Central and Southeastern Europe.
What I've loved is traveling around Central and Eastern Europe in their footsteps in one way or another, and thinking about what it would have been like to have been an ordinary citizen, or not so ordinary subject, of the Habsburgs. I think I was very lucky with all my travels because obviously Central Europe and Eastern Europe are absolutely fascinating places, and in a way it was a privilege to travel with a purpose. I was always there was no limit to how much time I could spend walking around any town, knowing that sooner or later I would find some interesting pub or graveyard or church or someone to talk to who would somehow bring something to life.
His travels in the footsteps of the Habsburgs also take Simon Winder to mysterious places, such as the plaster cellar in the Vienna Hofburg, which is not open to the public. There are new things to discover everywhere.
There is no limit to how long one could talk about the Habsburgs because they are so interesting and important, and their responsibilities were totally beyond what, as normal human beings, they could hope to achieve. But what they were very good at was carrying on, marrying the right people and having children. There was a dynasty that managed more or less to replicate itself in a ruthless way. And it was always through the male line. And so in the 18th century, when there wasn't a male line, they simply changed the rules in order to keep going. And it's their bare-faced sort of arrogance and greed in many ways is fascinating, but also the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. Some of them were great warriors, some of them were hopeless warriors, some of them were very self-indulgent, and some of them were extremely pious. And you get, when you go through all of them, you get almost every kind of human behavior.
The House, Court, and State archives in Vienna are one of the most important repositories of historical writings and documents relating to the history of the Habsburgs. Tens of thousands of archival records document the rise and fortunes of the dynasty and the lands it ruled. The Privilegium Maius is also kept here.
Important archival documents came here to Vienna from the Habsburg lands, specifically from the Habsburg seats of power in the various territories. And that actually explains the importance of the House, Court, and State archives as the selective archive of the Habsburg family. At the same time, it is also the archive of foreign policy, specifically all foreign policy documents up to 1918 are kept here in the House, Court, and State archives. And, last but not least, the archives of the highest authority of the Holy Roman Empire up to 1806 are also kept here. The Habsburgs, as head of the Holy Roman Empire, as emperors until 1806, also had the highest authorities here in Vienna. And all the records from the activities of these authorities are also kept here in Vienna. And that makes the House, Court, and State archives in Vienna one of the most important archives in Europe.
For Simon Winder and historian Christian Gepp, it is also something special to be able to view the most important documents in modern European history. These include the Treaty of Westphalia, which established the balance of power in Europe after the 30 Years' War. The documents show what an enormous task it was to govern the many Habsburg lands that stretched from the Atlantic coast to far southeastern Europe.
All the time, this area was controlled by the same family, the Habsburgs. It was always a bit of a mess, but the Habsburgs couldn't possibly control such a vast area. They had a series of deputies, other family members who were dukes of particular areas or whatever, but in the end their control was a bit confused, and it relied a lot on the Catholic Church to restore order. And so it was always a bit of a patchwork, and some of the family just weren't capable of doing the jobs that they found themselves inheriting, because their only authority was based on inheritance. You had to be the eldest son to do this job and that job. And sometimes the eldest son turned out to be a bit useless or actively terrible, whereas the second son would have been really good. But it was too bad. The second son would go off and become a priest somewhere, and the poor old first son was battling with his in-tray in a way which was not really very fair, either on him or his subjects.
Prague, with its mighty Prague Castle, is one of the most important and probably most beautiful resident cities of the Habsburgs as Roman German emperors and kings of Bohemia. Emperor Rudolf II, one of the most illustrious rulers of the House of Habsburg, also resided here.
Thinking about the Habsburgs, I think it's very difficult not to admire and be puzzled by particularly Rudolf II, who was emperor at a time of enormous change, and who, unfortunately for everyone living in Central Europe, retreated more and more into his life as a sort of wizard rather than as a military and political leader or religious leader. And he was a complex and fascinating and very gloomy man who didn't really want the job of being emperor. But he set aside a group of rooms in Prague Castle where he would collect dried crocodiles, or people would send in peculiar creatures that they'd found from exotic parts of the world, other creatures in bottles or strange fossils, which of course fossils weren't really understood then, so he collected these things himself. But meanwhile, unfortunately, the empire itself was falling to pieces through fighting between Catholics and Protestants, of which he just wasn't interested at all. So you'd have to say we admire him for his cultural interests, but equally he was an absolute disaster as an emperor.
In the early 17th century, an incident occurs in Prague with far-reaching consequences. The conflict between the confessions in the empire had long since become a political trial of strength, with the Catholic Habsburgs under Emperor Matthias on one side and the Protestant princes on the other. In 1618, representatives of the Bohemian nobility threw the emperor's envoys out of Prague Castle. The Defenestration of Prague is the trigger for the 30 Years' War. The war also raged in Alsace, the ancestral home of the Habsburgs, and in Strasbourg, with the Habsburgs losing Alsace to France in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Numerous historical records attest to the city's close connection with the Habsburgs, which dates back to the 11th century. The dynasty has also left a lasting mark on the cityscape of Strasbourg. The main testimony to the Habsburgs in Strasbourg is Strasbourg Cathedral, definitely the third cathedral. The cathedral you see now is the fourth, but the third cathedral was built by Werner in 1015, and Werner is probably a member of the Habsburg family. The Habsburg family didn't exist back then, but they were the proto-Habsburgs, the Habsburgs before the Habsburg. And of course, there are also many other reminders of Habsburg on the cathedral. There is also a statue of Rudolf von Habsburg, which has been given the place of honor at the cathedral, to the right of the main entrance.
Rechts von dem Haupteingang.
The 30 Years' War marks the end of Habsburg rule in Alsace after half a millennium, and the country is awarded to France in the Peace of Westphalia. What the Habsburgs were unable to achieve in many German principalities in the north and northwest, they succeeded in doing in the southeast of the empire. In the 17th century, the imperial resident city of Graz became the center of the re-Catholicization of its lands of Austria, Styria, and Carinthia. Graz has, of course, been closely linked to the House of Habsburg since Emperor Frederick III, who initially resided mainly in Wiener Neustadt.
Due to dynastic and power political necessities, however, it was necessary to move the residents from Wiener Neustadt further into Inner Austria, and Graz was a very good choice. There was already a high castle here. There was the ducal court in Herrengasse, where Frederick sat in court, where he made enfeoffments. Obviously, however, this ducal court was not representative enough for him, and so in 1438 he began building a representative complex, his castle, with the purpose of being the residence of his family, as an administrative seat, but also as a defense against the East.
Frederick's son, Emperor Maximilian I, rarely visited Graz, preferring Innsbruck as his residence. However, Graz has him to thank for the double spiral staircase in Graz Castle, one of the most important treasures of Gothic architecture. A major research project is dedicated to the building history of the castle, and some rooms, such as the former castle chapel, are being restored to their original state. Old wall paintings, which are being carefully restored, are coming to light under more recent layers of paint. In any case, the castle is a symbol of the importance of Graz at the end of the Middle Ages.
Through this rise to the top of the empire, Graz became the residence of the entire Holy Roman Empire for decades under Frederick III, until he finally left the city in 1484.
In the early 16th century, at the time of the Reformation, Graz was flourishing, but Prince Charles II of Inner Austria wanted to enforce the Catholic faith by any means necessary. Graz was also of great geopolitical importance in the 16th century.
One of the great challenges of the reign of Charles II and then of Ferdinand II, as for the Habsburg Dynasty in general in the 16th and 17th centuries, was of course the military threat posed by the Ottomans. And of course, the court of Graz, the Graz government, the Styrian sovereign, the Inner Austrian sovereign had an eminently important position here, as the so-called military border was part of his territory. In other words, a kind of fortress belt to protect the Inner Austrian lands, but also the other Habsburg lands from the threat posed by the Ottomans.
Probably the most impressive testimony to the time of the Ottoman threat in Graz is the armory in the center of Graz. The world's largest collection of historical armor, cutting and stabbing weapons, and firearms.
We have a completely different geopolitical situation at this time. There are two great empires facing each other. On the one side was the Habsburg Empire. On the other, the Ottoman Empire, which had been expanding very successfully towards the West and Europe since the 15th century. And this situation led to the creation of a military border. Styria was practically responsible for part of this border, or was responsible here in Graz for equipping this border with weapons.
In total, the collection in the Graz Armory comprises 32,000 suits of armor and weapons for 16,000 soldiers, which were used time and again in the dreaded Turkish invasions and battles against the Ottomans.
Although Graz, with its armory, developed into practically the most important equipment center in the southeast of the Habsburg Empire, it was at the same time only one point on a whole map of fortifications and positions in the run-up to this military border, which in the case of the Windisch military border was in present-day Croatia, with the center in Varaždin. And it was from here that weapons were supplied to the southeast when needed, and from here that local armories and fortifications were equipped.
The Catholic sovereigns felt threatened not only by the Ottomans, but also by the rapid spread of the new Protestant faith. However, the Counter-Reformation also leads to an impressive flourishing of the town on the moor. The peak of importance was clearly visible in the late 16th century. The city was expanded in every nook and cranny, including the castle on the Schlossberg. This was related to the wars against the Ottoman Empire, but also to the absolute will of the Habsburgs to make Styria and Graz completely Catholic again, and to express this through the corresponding buildings in the Graz city area. One of the most important buildings in the crown of the town, an ensemble of buildings in the city center of Graz, is the cathedral. Built under the Roman German Emperor Frederick III, who also regularly attended Mass here.
Today's cathedral was built under Emperor Frederick III as the court church of Graz Castle. His successor, Charles II of Inner Austria, then turned this cathedral into a Jesuit church and gave the Jesuits a site right next to Graz Cathedral, today's Jesuit College. And the last major expansion phase, which actually elevated this castle, the cathedral church and all the outbuildings to the crown of the town, was the mausoleum commissioned by Archduke Ferdinand, son of Charles II, from 1614. This mausoleum is a crowning final building, a burial place that is to serve the archdukes and later the emperor himself. None other than Giovanni Pietro de Bomis was commissioned to produce the design for the building. It was an Italian master builder whom Charles had already brought to Graz with his wife, Maria, who was practically the advertising strategist of the Counter-Reformation. And we must understand this entire complex here in the crown of the town as a Counter-Reformation statement. I think you can see from this burial place, and also from the reason that he is being laid to rest here, that he had a close relationship with this city. You have to know that Emperor Ferdinand II only visited Graz once after the start of the construction before he was buried here. So he never even saw the mausoleum finished. He visited the city one last time in 1619. But I still believe that you can see the very deep relationship he had with this city, which is why he later had himself, his wife, and his 14-year-old son buried here in the mausoleum.
The Protestant sovereigns had already strongly promoted the arts and science in Graz, and the Counter-Reformation also relied on the impact of education and art.
The beginning of Graz as an educational and university city probably goes back to Charles II. It was the age of the Reformation and the beginning of the Counter-Reformation. And Charles II naturally brought the Jesuits into the country as a reformist order, an order that was one of the pioneers of Catholic reform. And this particular university was founded in 1585.
With the university, Jesuit college, and Jesuit grammar school, a veritable educational cluster is created in Graz. In the remote valleys of Styria and Carinthia, however, followers of the Protestant faith were brutally persecuted.
Martin Brenner, who at the time was the Prince Bishop of Seckau, went through the country with military cover and churches were taken by force. Protestant preachers were forcibly expelled. The Catholic faith was therefore not only enforced through conviction, but also to a large extent by force.
Many people of the Protestant faith are expelled, forced to leave their homeland and settle in the southeast of the Habsburg Empire. Others who escaped the counter-reformers practiced their faith in secret places. The so-called Dog Church near Stockenboy in Carinthia is an impressive testimony to this difficult time. It was not only religious conflicts that brought unimaginable suffering to the population, but also the repeated invasions of Ottoman troops, who burned down numerous villages and often cruelly murdered entire families. The fortified church of Hochfeistritz in Carinthia is a reminder of this time. Many churches in the countryside were extended and fortified with a strong wall, behind which the people found protection. Klagenfurt, today the capital of Carinthia, was one of the cities that flourished during the Reformation. After the medieval town fell victim to a fire, Emperor Maximilian I donated the ruins to the Corinthian provincial estates, who soon converted to the new Protestant faith. The Land House, a representative building in the style of the Italian Renaissance, becomes a symbol of the strengthened self-confidence of the estates. The coat of arms hall is adorned with the coats of arms of Corinthian noble families and frescoes depicting the imperial donation of the town. The Kievenhuller family, originally a successful family of tradesmen from Bavaria who were elevated to the nobility in the 16th century, are among the most important Corinthian noble families. In 1571, Georg von Kievenhuller acquired Hochosterwit Castle near the town of St. Veit an der Glan and had it extended by an Italian fortress builder in the Renaissance style. The confessional division in Europe soon also affects the Kievenhuller family. Numerous members became Protestants during the Reformation. although some of them were in the service of the Catholic Habsburgs.
Yes, the Reformation was, of course, the moving moment in the 16th century. Not only did it tear the imperial family apart, but also the whole of society. And so it also affected the Kievenhuller family, and Protestants emigrated. Specifically, my ancestor Georg, who built Hohostervit Castle, had two sons, Franz, a Catholic, and Sigmund, a Protestant. Sigmund had to leave the country. His son Paul even went to Sweden, taking all the goods he could take with him and standing by the King of Sweden, Gustav Adolf. And now this terrible 30 Years' War broke out, and there were representatives of the Kievenhuller family on the Swedish side, on the Protestant side, and other Kievenhullers on the Catholic side, on the imperial side, and they fought each other. At the defenestration of Prague, there were Kievenhullers on both the Catholic and Protestant sides, and one of them was thrown out of the window. Not the Kievenhuller, but someone who was thrown out of the window.
The principle laid down in the Peace of Augsburg, that the sovereign decides on the religious affiliation of his subjects, also applies to the Habsburg lands. Anyone who is not Catholic has to leave the country. Some of the Kievenhullers remain loyal to the Catholic imperial family. The young diplomat Hans von Kievenhuller soon made an unprecedented career at the imperial court.
It's just as civilized and just as interesting as now, but just different.
In 1558, at the age of 20, he had studied in Padua. Hans was hired to work for the emperor. He was then sent to Spain by Maximilian II as an ambassador and worked there for a long time as an advisor to Philip II, and also actually became a friend of Philip II. And his work developed in particular when Maximilian II died and his wife Maria, who was Philip II's sister, went back to Spain and entered a convent there. Hans naturally had an incredible position as ambassador to Rudolf II, the son, the current emperor, and also as a former confidant of Maximilian and his wife Maria. And from 1581 to 1603, when the empress died, power was seated in Madrid, and power was divided between the King of Spain, Philip, his sister Maria, and the emperor's representative at court, Hans. These three were actually the ones who ruled the entire empire.
The story of his ancestor, Hans, has fascinated Karl Kievenhuller for decades. In the diaries of the imperial envoy, Karl found a clue to the final resting place of Hans.
Yes, about 30 years ago, I was really confronted for the first time with the fact that the grave of this Hans Kievenhuller was in Madrid, in this former coronation church of Los Hieronymus. And there were remains of a statue there. There were the remains of a gravestone there, and I was given permission to search for the remains with archaeologists, and I really did find the remains. It was a very moving situation for me when this stone was removed from what I thought was the grave, and there was actually a hole in the wall behind it. And I found the bones in this hole in the wall. And I was then told that it didn't have to be my ancestor. It could be also some priest. But when I stuck my head in there and shone my flashlight in and saw the bones, as well as the remains of his robe and rusty pieces of iron from his sword, which can also be seen in the picture we saw up here, I knew from the start that it was Hans.
Today, a memorial plaque commemorates the imperial envoy from Carinthia. Karl Kiepenheuler had the grave and statue extensively restored. Like most of his German relatives, King Philip II of the Spanish line of the House of Austria was deeply religious. He had the monastery of El Escorial built in the north of Madrid, which became his preferred place of residence and the burial place of the Spanish Habsburgs.
Although Philip II's court was in Madrid, he spent much of his summers here, especially the religious feast days. And it must be remembered that the empire was ruled from here, as the royal palace of Madrid no longer existed. The monastic palace was the great spiritual center of the empire. Apart from the religious ornaments and representations, Philip II had around 7,000 relics here in the monastery, which was a reaction to the Protestants, who did not believe in the mediating function of saints. The Escorial monastery became a bastion of Catholicism.
In a prayer room of the Escorial, marble reliefs commemorate the close relationship between Hans von Kiepenheuler and Philip II. The scenes show the presentation of a host that Hans brought from the imperial court in Prague to give to the king.
The ambassadors were of fundamental importance for communication between the two branches of the House of Austria, especially Hans Kiepenheuler, who lived in Spain from 1572 until his death in 1606. He frequently sent gifts and portraits and made sure that the often secret correspondence arrived safely when he traveled to Vienna or Prague. And then he traveled back to Spain with other envoys, who also contributed to the positive development of relations between the two houses.
And just as Hans von Kiepenheuler regularly visited the El Escorial monastery more than 400 years ago to discuss political agendas with Philip and his advisors, Karl Kiepenheuler also visits the extensive complex time and again in the footsteps of his ancestor. Another trail leads to Segovia in central Spain. Next to a small river is an extensive complex of buildings that has been restored at great expense. The Mint of Segovia.
Well, it was Philip II and Hans Kiepenheuler, his ambassador to the court from Germany, that was the contact for bringing this technology from the Mint in Holland, Tyrol to Segovia. The agreement was made between Philip II and the Archduke of Tyrol in 1581 to bring the machinery and to implant the mint here in Segovia. The machinery arrived here in 1584, and within 4 weeks, the German technicians had the roller mills rolling, and they were striking trial coins within 4 weeks. One of the curious things is the first group of 6 Tyroleans that came here disappeared after they got off the boat in Cartagena. And there's several documents that mention they never found them again. They just completely disappeared. They went off somewhere. Spain's a big party country, and they just went off and had a good time.
Sevilla on the Guadalquivir River is the most important port of this period. Shiploads of gold and silver from the New World were first stored in the Gold and Silver Tower before being pressed in Segovia and other mints. The riches from the New World gave Seville a long period of economic prosperity that lasted far beyond the Habsburg period. The numerous incestuous connections between members of the ruling dynasty led to serious genetic defects. The Spanish line of the Habsburgs died out with Charles II of Spain in 1700. When the German line was threatened with the same fate, Emperor Charles VI issued the Pragmatic Sanction. It stipulates that female descendants may also rule over the Habsburg lands, thus ensuring the continuation of the dynasty.